Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now continue with the Roundtable's first session on ASEAN's Balancing Act, Fractured Order, and Fluid Alignments. Ms. Joanne Lin, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Center at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, will be moderating this session. Her panelists are Ambassador Daniel Kritenbrink, Dr. Ma Bo, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, and Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak. Ms. Lin, please.
Fantastic. Yes, a very good morning, Excellencies, distinguished guests, speakers, and colleagues. It's really my privilege to moderate our first panel of the 40th ASEAN Roundtable on ASEAN's Balancing Act, Fractured Order, and Fluid Alignments. So this session will definitely be setting the tone for today's discussion on how Southeast Asia is navigating one of the most complex and uncertain strategic environments in recent decades, as we heard earlier. So this sentiment was also strongly echoed by the ASEAN leaders at the recently concluded ASEAN summit, where they described the region as being dynamic and rapidly evolving. So the world that we know today is really marked by deep uncertainty. The tariff-driven trade policies in the United States once again disrupted the global supply chains and added new pressure on ASEAN's economies that really dependent on open markets and trade flows. And that was what our CE, Mr. Choi, has just mentioned earlier. And I think meanwhile, the widening geopolitical fault lines, from conflicts in the Middle East to Ukraine, to intensifying technological and security rivalries, have also eroded the stability of the global order that ASEAN has once relied upon. So, of course, we know that we have many issues to discuss in this panel. But I would say that amidst these shifts, our region also continues to grapple with very familiar flashpoints from the slow progress on the code of conduct in the South China Sea to the protracted conflict in Myanmar, as well as the internal frictions that test ASEAN's consensus-based model. So at the same time, the broader order is no longer unipolar or bipolar as we know it, but increasingly multipolar and fragmented. And of course, we now have more choices, right? And even food choices that Minister Liu mentioned earlier. But of course, with that, ASEAN has to chart its own course amidst the shifting alignments and competing agendas. So I hope that this session will really help us to explore important questions on how ASEAN can preserve its strategic autonomy and relevance while managing the complex interplay between US, China, the growing middle powers, and also the global South partners. So can ASEAN continue to serve as a fulcrum of regional order as the multilateralism weakens and mini-lateral groupings proliferates? And really, how can it redefine its diplomatic hedging to sustain cohesion and credibility amidst the competing norms and narratives? So these questions will also determine whether ASEAN can continue to shape the regional architecture or risk being shaped by it. So help us to unpack this. We are very privileged to have with us four eminent speakers, each bringing a wealth of experience and very distinct perspective from the worlds of the diplomacy and academia. So let me just briefly introduce the speakers, and for their full bio, which is very rich, please refer to our program. So starting with Ambassador Daniel Kritenbrink, he is a partner at the Asia Group and the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, with over 3 decades of diplomatic experience shaping U.S. policy across the Indo-Pacific. And Dr. Mapo is an associate professor at the Nanjing University School of International Studies and assistant director at the China Center for collaborative study of the South China Sea. And next, we have Ambassador Nirupama Rao, who is currently a distinguished visiting research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies. She was a former Foreign Secretary of India and former ambassador to the US, India, Sri Lanka, all of which are important. And China, yes, US, China, and Sri Lanka, all of which are very important countries, especially in the Indian context. So Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak is a professor of international relations at Chulalongkorn University and currently the senior fellow at the Institute of Security and International Studies in Bangkok. And he's one of Thailand's foremost political scientists and regional commentators. I read your work a lot and I agree with many things you say. I continue to want to hear what you have to say today. So very glad to have all of you here with us today. So I'm now going to turn to our first speaker, Ambassador Kritenbrink, who has really been at the forefront of US engagement in Asia for many years. So Ambassador, in the wake of the President Trump's visit to Kuala Lumpur, where he actually reaffirmed 100%, commitment to Southeast Asia. Really, we would like to hear your insights on how Washington is really redefining its regional strategy and what ASEAN can expect from the US moving forward. So you have 15 minutes, and similarly, we have 15 minutes for all the speakers. So over to you, Ambassador.
Great. Thank you, Joanne. Good morning, everyone. Dan Kritenbrink, deeply honored to be here. As Joanne mentioned, I'm now a partner at the Asia Group where we help our clients navigate the intersection of geopolitics and corporate strategy. But as a recently retired 31-year American career diplomat, I believe in this region. I'm a true believer in ASEAN and Southeast Asia, and I think you'll see that come through in my remarks. I'm particularly grateful to ISEAS Director Choi Shing-kwak, Ambassador and Chairwoman Chan Hung-chi, and many other friends here. And I thank Minister Liu Chin-tong for such an inspiring and substantive keynote address. The primary argument that I intend to make this morning is that ASEAN matters more to the United States today than at any point in recent memory. And I also believe that the United States remains vitally important to ASEAN. The region, of course, is home to 700 million people, the world's 5th largest economy, and sits at the strategic crossroads of global trade and technology. And that remains true even under the second Trump administration. While the tone may be more transactional and the tactics more unpredictable, I believe in many key respects that certain fundamentals have not changed, namely that ASEAN is essential to America's economic reach, supply chain resilience, and strategic interests, just as the United States remains essential to ASEAN's continued growth, stability, and security. I believe that our interdependence is not rhetorical, it's real, it's deep, and it is enduring. So to support the argument that I've just made, I would like to make 6 primary points. Let me just say first, again, ASEAN matters to the United States, I think, more than ever before. Obviously, as all of you know, ASEAN represents approximately 700 million people. That would be the world's 3rd largest population, spans over 1.7 million square miles, has a combined GDP of $3.62 trillion. It is the world's 5th largest economy globally and the 3rd fastest growing in the Indo-Pacific. It serves as a major engine of global consumption and labor supply with an expanding middle class and a young workforce of 338 million people. For the United States, ASEAN and its 11 member states remains a critical economic partner. The US and ASEAN enjoy more than $508 billion in bilateral trade annually. It makes ASEAN America's 4th largest export market and the 2nd largest trading partner. ASEAN companies have invested over $34 billion in the United States, supporting more than 625,000 American jobs. ASEAN is also the hub of the world's fastest growing digital economy. ASEAN's digital market is predicted to reach $1 trillion by 2030. ASEAN is emerging as Asia's data center hub and plays a strategic role in global technology supply chains, including providing nearly half of the semiconductors used in the United States. Geopolitically, of course, ASEAN sits at the center of US-China competition. Don't need to tell anybody in this room that. Its location along critical sea lanes, including in the South China Sea, through which $3.4 trillion of global trade passes annually, makes stability in ASEAN vital to US security and global commerce. ASEAN's institutional architecture also gives the United States a strategic anchor in the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN remains the region's only real and most effective multilateral mechanism. ASEAN centrality is not just a goal or a slogan. It is, in my view, reality. And mechanisms such as the East Asia Summit allow the US to shape regional norms, maintain strategic presence, and engage major powers on neutral ground. ASEAN's convening power creates diplomatic space that no other regional institution can provide. Second, I believe that the United States obviously continues to matter to ASEAN as a major investor, leading export market, hub for world-class businesses, and a key driver of regional stability and balance with China, including in the South China Sea. Again, I believe that the US is a key strategic partner for ASEAN in maintaining regional stability and balancing Chinese influence. Washington conducts over 40 military exercises annually with ASEAN states, has provided $3.2 billion in security assistance and arms transfers just over the last decade, and consistently supports freedom of navigation, international law, and the rights of ASEAN claimant states in territorial disputes. The US also plays a central role in ASEAN as Southeast Asia's largest source of investment, contributing $532 billion in 2024 alone. More than 6,200 US businesses operate across ASEAN, including major players like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon Web Service, and many others. The US remains ASEAN's second largest trading partner after China and is the top export market for a third of its members. These trade ties anchor supply chain resilience and offers ASEAN diversified market access. And across sectors, the United States and ASEAN continue to cooperate through the US-ASEAN Comprehensive Strategic Partnership and the ASEAN-US Plan of Action. Third, I'd like to comment on the Trump administration's current policy approach toward ASEAN and Southeast Asia across trade, security, and diplomacy. On trade, undoubtedly, the second Trump term's approach to ASEAN is overtly transactional, and it is centered on bilateral, quote-unquote, reciprocal trade deals rather than multilateral frameworks. Tariffs are being used as leverage to secure deeper market access, reshape supply chains, and push Southeast Asian economies toward US standards on export controls, digital trade, and critical minerals. Rather than engaging ASEAN as a unified bloc, the Trump administration has pursued country-specific agreements with a focus on sectors such as critical minerals, digital trade, and infrastructure. US policies, again, have generally been, under the second Trump administration, deeply disconcerting to many friends in the region and highly disruptive. Despite that being the case, the region has engaged the Trump administration very proactively and productively, and now tariff levels have settled into a 19 to 20% range across Southeast Asia, apart from Singapore, of course, which is at 10%, and at 15% for Japan and Korea. So it appears to me that US tariff levels, at least the reciprocal tariff levels, have now largely settled. They appear more manageable, and I have sensed a significant amount of relief across the region as a result. Relief does not equal happiness. I'm not sure I've met any Asian friends who are happy with these trade policies, and if I told you a year ago that regional friends would be relieved regarding the prospect of 15 to 20% tariffs, you would have called me crazy. But I do think that is the current situation. I also think the conclusion of formal trade agreements between the United States and Malaysia and Cambodia on this most recent trip by President Trump are highly significant and actually quite encouraging. But despite what I see as the increased certainty and the seeming sense of relief on partners in the region, there are still many sources of concern and uncertainty regarding trade, including many details of the various trade frameworks that have been negotiated between the United States and regional countries remain unresolved and the subject of quite tense and difficult ongoing negotiations, especially regarding economic security provisions and so-called transshipment and matters related to Chinese content. There also remains the risk of disruption from US sectoral or 232 tariffs, including areas such as semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. Yet even here, I've been struck by the increased flexibility shown by the Trump administration, even on sectoral tariffs in some of the recent bilateral negotiations. Regarding security policy, under Defense Secretary Hegseth, the United States has reasserted a hard deterrence posture, underscoring U.S. commitment to the Indo-Pacific through expanded military exercises, defense dialogues, and renewed basing cooperation. I'm sure you'll all recall at the 2025 Shangri-La Dialogue, Secretary Hegseth warned China against altering the status quo over Taiwan and the South China Sea, and urged ASEAN partners to increase defense spending and interoperability under a shared deterrence framework. Diplomatically, the Trump administration has sustained unusually high-level engagement with Southeast Asia throughout 2025. And that, to me, signals that even under its transactional model, the region remains important and central to Washington's regional strategy. And if you look, for example, at visits by the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, the USTR Ambassador, I think they show that every major US cabinet agency is now engaged in Southeast Asia policy. And again, I think President Trump's recent visit to the region, including his state visit to Malaysia, reflects this approach, blending trade negotiation, security signaling, and symbolic diplomacy. President Trump showcased his deal-maker approach through bilateral trade announcements with Malaysia and Cambodia. I think they're highly significant, and especially for the Malaysian deal, I think that could serve as a model for the rest of the region, or at least I expect the Trump administration to attempt to use the deal in that way. President Trump publicly supported the Thailand-Cambodia de-escalation process, and I think this demonstrated remaining US diplomatic influence. The president also used the trip to push forward unresolved negotiations with Vietnam and Thailand via new joint statements. I think there's a lot of work that remains to be done on both of those, but nonetheless, I thought that was a positive signal. Fourth, the United States, through its government, military companies, and investors, continues to play a key role in Southeast Asia despite policy shifts under the Trump administration, and I believe there are still clear reasons why the region should continue to count on US leadership. Despite the policy uncertainty unleashed by the Trump administration, we, for example, in our current work at the Asia Group and working with our clients, we see long-term trends in ASEAN of supply chain diversification, digitization, and clean energy transition continuing. And they're still creating trade and investment opportunities in both the near and the long term. As unconventional as some provisions in the recent new agreements between the United States and Malaysia and Cambodia, these trade deals still primarily focus on long-standing traditional issues that impact our trading relationship and have been the subject of negotiations and consultations for several years. The President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense have all repeatedly reaffirmed US security commitments to treaty allies, including right here in Southeast Asia, and particularly regarding the South China Sea. And even as US foreign assistance has been greatly reduced, funding for foreign military financing, secure digital networks, and infrastructure connectivity in ASEAN continue. Fifth, let me make a couple of comments on strategies that I believe have proven most effective for engaging the United States under President Trump's second term and some of the lessons learned. My bottom line here is that whether you are a regional country or a private company, I believe it is always in your interest to engage the United States and the Trump administration. Just like the first Trump administration and virtually every US administration before it, this administration is shapeable, particularly if engaged in a skillful and clever way. I'll highlight one example here for Vietnam only because I know the example well. It's great to be here with the Vietnamese ambassador today. But during President Trump's first term, I was the US ambassador to Hanoi, and I think Vietnam effectively navigated shifting US policies at that time, by proactively engaging top US leaders. I think Vietnam, despite the very clear differences under the second Trump administration, has still followed that model of proactively and positively engaging. I recall, for example, that Vietnamese General Secretary Do Lam was the first world leader to call President Trump after the April 2 so-called Liberation Day announcement. And I think that that phone call helped launch a path of productive negotiations with the United States that has brought reciprocal tariff levels down from 46% to 20%. I know there's still a long way to go, but I think that that is the sort of model that I'm talking about. I think Vietnam and regional peers such as Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines are all learning to adapt to President Trump's transactional approach to diplomacy, starting with proactively initiating high-level dialogue and offering strategic deliverables that align well with U.S. interests. Regarding Malaysia, I do think Prime Minister Anwar has been particularly successful and skillful at calculating key strategies for engagement with President Trump through direct and personal appeal. As ASEAN chair, Prime Minister Anwar used Malaysia's role to very skillfully and successfully negotiate a ceasefire between Thailand and Cambodia, a very significant achievement regarding the first open conflict between two ASEAN member states since 2008. And I think the Prime Minister helped invite President Trump's involvement in that deal in a way that was quite constructive to the final outcome. I think that decision proved shrewd for Prime Minister Anwar, as he could leverage President Trump's interest so as to secure the president's visit to Kuala Lumpur for the East Asia Summit, and also in concluding Southeast Asia's first bilateral trade agreement with the United States under the Trump administration. Likewise, I think Philippine President Marcos completed a successful visit to the White House earlier this year. He showed flexibility in trade negotiations to help secure President Trump's publicly reaffirming the alliance with Manila, and the president also issued a reassurance of continued U.S. support to the Philippines in the South China Sea. With Singapore, of course, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has very publicly stated his concerns with Liberation Day tariffs, and yet I think friends in Singapore have still skillfully engaged the Trump administration and have certainly avoided any kind of direct conflict in those negotiations. Sixth and finally, I'd like to address the question of how does Washington define success in its engagement with ASEAN? What can the U.S. do to reassure the region that it remains a reliable partner? Again, I'm not speaking on behalf of the administration. I'm just trying to be very candid about what I see. I continue to believe that Washington's overarching goal is to reinforce its role as Southeast Asia's preeminent security and economic partner. Still hopes to see a free and open Indo-Pacific where countries can choose their economic and security paths free from coercion. I think the objective of a free and open Indo-Pacific has remained consistent across U.S. foreign policy. I also think more than ever before that showing up matters. I know that many friends in ASEAN have been concerned about the fact that not every American president has always been present in the region. I think the president is famous for not being particularly fond of multilateral diplomacy, and yet despite that being the case, he became only the third U.S. president to visit Malaysia since 1967. And as I outlined earlier, virtually every significant Trump cabinet member involved in foreign policy and economic policy has visited ASEAN. So I think the U.S. government's engagement in U.S. government's engagement and influence in Southeast Asia has waxed and waned over the decades, but we also shouldn't forget that the U.S. business sector remains the bedrock of our relationship, and I've already given you the data on our investment levels. So in closing, I would reiterate, despite the disruption and uncertainty of the Trump administration, particularly regarding its trade policies, the United States and ASEAN remain indispensable to each other's success. ASEAN continues to anchor U.S. influence and commerce across the region, while the U.S. remains a vital source of investment, innovation, and strategic balance. I think the lesson from the countries I've mentioned here and others is also clear. Those who engage Washington early, proactively, and pragmatically, and with tangible deliverables still find opportunity and partnership. Administrations change, but their core and fundamental interests and those of the region do not. So the task now is to keep our partnership grounded in mutual benefit and forward momentum, because I continue to believe that a confident, connected ASEAN working alongside a committed United States remains the surest path to a stable and open Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those insightful remarks on America's role and future commitment to the region. We heard that there's actually plenty of opportunity for trade, investment through the strong private sector that you spoke of. Of course, investment and defense remains a very critical stabilizer in our region. Of course, there are uncertainties, right, that you mentioned due to Trump's transactional and unpredictable personality. And of course, there are technical details in trade agreements to be worked out. And, there are also security implications to understand as well. So we will definitely take your clue, your tip to find ways to engage with President Trump in a skillful and clever way, hopefully as a bloc, not as individual ASEAN member states. And then maybe we can also present him with some grand gifts that are gold-plated, a grand dinner. Maybe that might all help, the region. Okay, thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Mapo. I'm sorry if your bio, I introduced it very briefly, but anyway, Mapo is an incredible academic from the Nanjing University, and I have heard his very remarkable comments on this topic. So Dr. Mapo is going to speak on navigating China's influence and maritime tensions in the region. So definitely we welcome your views on how China perceives its role as ASEAN, in ASEAN, and how both sides can manage differences while building trust. I think that's the most important message that we hope to hear from you today. So 15 minutes over to you, Dr. Mapo.
Yes, thank you, Joanne, for introducing me, and it's definitely a privilege to be in this panel. I have been assigned to talk about China's influence in this region and also the South China Sea tensions. But before starting that, I want to speak a few sentences on China-Singapore relation. As you all know, that China and Singapore are working to build a forward-looking partnership. I must admit, for a long time, I wasn't so sure about what forward-looking really means. So until this year's ISEAS ASEAN Roundtable, just think about the timing. 5 days ago, Chinese Premier Li Qiang was here in Singapore for an official visit. 3 days ago, he was in Malaysia for the ASEAN Summit. And yesterday, President Xi Jinping met Donald Trump, APEC Summit in Korea. And today, here we are, which our organizers schedule months in advance. Now I understand what a forward-looking partner is for China. Okay, now I want to talk about what China's influence or perhaps a contribution in this region. I think since late 1970s, when China began its reform and opening up, China made two enduring contributions to the region and perhaps to the world. The first is the peaceful resolution of conflicts. So we are very familiar with democratic peace theory, right? So the belief that democracy don't really fight each other, that spreading democracy can lead to perpetual peace. So the US has long pursued these versions, yet history shows that while its goal may be peace, its means have often relied on coercion and the use of force. So these military interventions justify in the name of freedom or humanitarian interventions, often left behind instabilities and prolonged sufferings. So, but China's approach is different. It shares the same aspiration like global peace, but define peace not only as a destination, but also a pathway. So peace, thus, is both the goal and the means of achieving it. So China's record is clear since the 1979 border war with Vietnam. China has not engaged in warfare with any other country, nor has it resorted to force to settle disputes. Among all P5 countries, I think China is probably the only one keep such records. So this long-standing restraint I think is deeply arched in China's cultural tradition, particularly the Confucian ideas of harmony, moderation, and self-restraint. As Confucius taught, do not impose on others what you do not desire yourself. So complementing this philosophical heritage is China's historical memories, particularly the so-called the century of humiliation from the 1840 to the 1940s. So when foreign power seized Chinese territory, undermined its sovereignty, so the Opium War, the unequal treaties, and the Japanese invasion leave deep scars on the national identity. Having once been conquered and divided, China understands profoundly the cost and the suffering of war and domination. So together, this cultural tradition and historical trauma have shaped China's instinct to pursue peace through diplomacy, patience, and compromise. So for China, peace is not a slogan, it is a deeply internalized principle, a moral and a strategic compass that continue to guide its conduct in world affairs. I think the second major contribution for China in this region is internationalism. From the painful lesson of the century of humiliation, China learned that closing the door means falling behind. The reform and opening up policy was not only an economic transformation, but also a philosophical awakening. Isolation leads to weakness, while engagement brings strength. So today, President Xi Jinping's vision of a community with a shared future for mankind reflects these convictions. It rests on a simple truth. Humanity can prosper only together, otherwise we face crisis and destruction that spare no one. So this commitment to internationalism is most visible in the Belt and Road Initiative, which promote connectivity and shared development across continents, infrastructure-based expression of cooperation through interdependence. So it is further reflected in a broader set of initiatives. For instance, the Global Development Initiative, which means to advance inclusive growth. The Global Security Initiative, it means promote common and indivisible security. The Global Civilization Initiative means foster intercultural dialogue. And the latest Global Governance Initiative, seeking fair representation for the Global South country. So together, this form of China's version of cooperative and reformist internationalism, reshaping global governance through consensus rather than confrontation. I think this outlook is not entirely new. It builds on the revolutionary internationalism of Chairman Mao. When China aligned with the third world country in solidarities against colonialism and imperialism, today China carries this empathy forward, but through a multilateral, not revolutionary framework. So by emphasizing defense of the UN-centered world order, China signals its belief in multilateralism and sovereign equality, not exclusively blocs. In this respect, China and the US share more common ground than often acknowledged. So I think China, since 1978, has been the beneficiary and now a reformer of the current order. Having prospered under globalization, it seeks to make a system fair and more representative, particularly for the global South, a community which it identifies now and forever. So Vice Minister Liu Zhendong can reassure China will not form a G2 with the US in the foreseeable future. So by combining China's emphasis on the peaceful resolution of conflicts with its belief in internationalism, we can outline a coherent framework which I call peaceful internationalism. This stands in contrast to, yet in dialogue with, the liberal internationalism led by the US and the West. Both share fundamental principles such as market economy, interstate cooperation, and the multilateral institution, but differs in method and moral emphasis. So empirically, there is little evidence that a rising China seeks to building alliance, imposing hierarchies, or form balancing correlation against the US. Rather, China acts as a reformist stakeholder, working to make existing institutions more inclusive and representative. So I believe there are five interrelated features of what I call peaceful internationalism. Number one, China is hypersensitive over sovereignty issues. And the second, China is behave assertive about autonomy and independence. Three, China always adopt a defensive posture. Fourth, China like to use avoidance in conflicts. Five, China prefer to have a pluralism within the current liberal orders. So if you're taking this together, these features shows that peaceful internationalism is not an alternative world order, but an alternative interpretation of the current orders. So now I will get back to China's policy in the South China Sea. So by adopting this peaceful internationalism, if you see Beijing's guidance policy of South China Sea is shelve the dispute and pursue joint development, which actually the first component shelve the dispute demonstrate China's Confucian restraints and conflict avoidance tradition. Rather than resolving sovereignty claims through confrontation and use of force, Beijing proposed to defer them to prioritize stability and long-term relation over immediate gains. It reflects the principle that harmony should prevail even amid disagreements. The second element, pursued joint development, embedded the spirit of internationalism cooperation. It offered a practical mechanism for coexist economic collaboration despite political or legal differences, transforming peace as ideas into peace as a practice. So China's South China Sea strategy is neither purely assertive or entirely conciliatory. It represents an effort to reconcile sovereignty with shared development. So despite recurring tension, such as recent incident in the Second Thomas Short and the Scarborough Short, China has constantly preferred dialogue and Coast Guard level management over military escalation. Its continued engagement in Code of Conduct (COC) negotiation with ASEAN demonstrate a commitment to peaceful management rather than coercive settlement. Thus, peaceful internationalism helped explain Beijing's behavior, a combination of firmness in principle but flexible in practice. So as a conclusion, I think for China, peace is not a weakness, it's actually a wisdom. The region needs only look at the ongoing Israel-Gaza conflicts and the Russian-Ukraine war to see the consequences when dialogues give way to violence. So peace, in China's view, is the strength to manage differences without war, to pursue growth without coercions, and to seek order without conformities. If we can sustain that spirit in our region, particularly in the South China Sea, then ASEAN and China together can demonstrate that even in a fractured world, peaceful internationalism remains promising. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mapo, for your thoughtful analysis on China's regional outreach and the challenges of managing tensions. And definitely, I think we acknowledge China's growing footprint in the region, and no one is going to deny it. And I mean, definitely through the Belt and Road Initiative, as you have mentioned, more infrastructure development, and even coming up with many new ideas of the what you call community, for a shared future for mankind. I think these are all very good. And of course, I acknowledge that there are a lot of deep thinking involved in, Chinese policy. It's almost philosophical, and I'm trying to understand, what it all means and how do you actually cascade it to actually foreign policy. And of course, I also noted that, sovereignty and global peace is very, very important to China, and it means a lot to you. But I mean, in the context of South China Sea that really the region is facing, we really hope that, China can also rethink some of that, and also maybe rethink about the situation of Russia and Ukraine, if such principles really matters to China. Yeah, thank you very much. And then now I am going to pass the floor now to Ambassador Nirupama Rao to speak on the role of middle powers in a multipolar world. We look forward really to your views on how middle powers, including China, India, but of course India is also a more than a middle power, maybe a major power, I would say, can help ASEAN navigate this multipolar landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Firstly, I'd like to thank the ISEAS and Mr. Choi Shing Kwok for inviting me to be present here in your midst today. We listened to Minister Liu's remarks, brilliant analysis with great interest, and to my distinguished colleagues on the podium and to Joanne, my greetings. So I'm going to speak to you on the role of middle powers in a multipolar world. This was the topic chosen for me, and I'm here to deliver my take on that. Firstly, of course, I live in Bangalore, which is part of peninsular India. I always like to say I'm a peninsular Indian. And India, in many ways, is an omnidirectional country. When you look at the north of India with the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush bordering those regions, reaching out into Central Asia. And then there is the northeast of India, where I always say Southeast Asia begins. And as far as peninsular India is concerned, it's oriented to the Arab world, and it's oriented also to the Bay of Bengal world, and of course, Southeast Asia. And we meet here in Singapore, a center point on the map where the world converges in many ways. And it is a place that I think is a model for Asia's capacity and its position within Asia. It encapsulates an idea of Asia that I think is aspirational for all of us. Because when you step outside this room, you see the quiet efficiency of a city built on connection, and an island that has lived at a crossroads of cultures, ambitions, and the ebb and flow of global trade. And Singapore, very much like middle powers, knows what it means to navigate shifting currents. And today, those currents are picking up speed. In the space of just a few years, assumptions that once felt stable no longer hold valid. The global landscape is unsettled. Strategic competition between major powers has intensified, shaping decisions from capitals near and far. Trade, once the great connector, is increasingly framed through the lens of security. Supply chains are being rewired. Economic nationalism is rising. Conflicts in Europe and the Middle East cast long shadows across our region. Closer to home, tensions in the South China Sea and the tragedy in Myanmar remind us that the Indo-Pacific is not insulated from turmoil. We often reach for the word multipolar, but multipolarity is not a finished state. It is an unfolding process, uneven, unpredictable, still taking shape. Power is dispersing, responsibility is playing catch up. Now, this is where middle powers come in. Middle powers do not dominate. Their strength is different. They rely on the power of example, the power of convening, the power of coalition building and enabling solutions. They value openness because they have benefited from it. They value stability because they are vulnerable to its absence. And they understand that the world works best when no single actor dictates the rules. Earlier this year, in a commentary I wrote for the Straits Times, I argued that the Indo-Pacific has entered a period of complexity and churn, and that middle powers must adapt to this new era of strategic competition, not by retreating behind walls, but by deepening connectivity and cooperation. That remains my conviction. Middle powers cannot afford passivity. To protect our agency, we must step forward, invest in regional stability, and work with one another to prevent rivalry from becoming the cause of rupture. Influence does not drift naturally towards the middle. It has to be earned. What does leadership look in this environment? I suggest 3 responsibilities: to stabilize, to integrate, and to mediate. First, the responsibility to stabilize. Middle powers have a long tradition of supporting inclusive multilateralism. Rules and norms protect the interests of all, especially those who do not deploy overwhelming force. In moments of great power contestation, institutions fray, cooperation gets harder, and the temptation grows to work only with those who agree with us. Precisely then, we need the steady insistence that dialogue must continue, global problems need global responses, and international law remains the anchor of world order. Stabilizing does not mean freezing the status quo. It means preventing the world from splintering into closed blocks, preventing problems from turning into crises, and safeguarding the habit of talking to one another, not past one another. Middle powers stabilize by widening the circle of conversation, not narrowing it. They convene countries that rarely sit together. They keep open channels and do not abandon difficult diplomatic relationships. They bring empathy into negotiations that risk becoming purely transactional. This region knows that instinct. ASEAN has long served as a convener, a platform where very different outlooks meet under one roof. ASEAN does not impose, it invites, it creates space, and space in diplomacy is a kind of power. Stabilizing today also means recognizing that global challenges are economic, technological, and human. Climate change already reshapes security. Food insecurity, Public health vulnerabilities and debt burdens influence choices countries make. Middle powers can bridge the developed and developing worlds, insisting that the global agenda stays balanced, equitable, and anchored in shared responsibility. Secondly, there is the responsibility to integrate. Geopolitics cannot be separated from economics. Middle powers rely on openness to markets, to finance, to technology, and talent. Fragmentation threatens them most. Deeper regional integration is therefore not just about scale, it is about resilience, which has been mentioned before me also. It reduces vulnerability to shock. It expands options so we are not forced into dependence or binary choices. Here is an example that is both historical and contemporary. I've spoken of India's Goa and China's Macau. I recently reflected on their shared past, cultural, commercial, and religious links spanning Asian seas. Long before globalization became a slogan, Asia mastered the art of exchange. Ideas, goods, languages, traditions flowed through these coastal nodes, creating a tapestry of connection that enriched the societies they touched. Goa and Macau were small territories, yet they sat at crossroads where continents met, oceans linked, and cultures blended. Their influence did not come from size, it came from connection. They were windows to the world. That, in my view, is a lesson for middle powers. Integration is not only about trade agreements and infrastructure, it is cultural familiarity, educational exchange, and shared heritage. When we deepen human understanding, we strengthen the foundations of cooperation. And integration must now go beyond economics. Digital interdependence, sustainable energy networks, collaborative innovation, they're all areas we have to develop and intensify. Middle powers can shape standards in emerging technologies, support green transition, and ensure the benefits of growth are widely shared. Because if integration fails, if economies turn inward and societies retreat into suspicion, strategic fragmentation will follow. Thirdly, the responsibility to mediate. Now, let me be precise. Mediation in this sense does not mean inserting oneself into bilateral disputes, nor accepting outside arbitration on matters touching core sovereignty. Countries in this region, including my own, have well-grounded reason to guard against external involvement in such issues. For middle powers, mediation is different. It is the quiet, patient work of keeping conversations alive, the willingness to engage when others hesitate, the capacity to de-escalate not through pressure, but through presence. It means building channels so crises do not harden into conflict, offering good offices not to impose solutions, but to enable dialogue. And it begins closer to home. The situation in Myanmar weighs heavily on our region. The human suffering, displacement, and continuing conflict are a deep distress. ASEAN's task is difficult and unenviable. Progress has been limited, yet engagement, however incremental, matters. We need moderate firmness, clarity of purpose, consistency of message, steady commitment to humanitarian relief, and inclusive dialogue. Middle powers can support ASEAN not by overshadowing it, but by reinforcing it through assistance, principled diplomacy, and support for regional consensus. Sure. And mediation also means habits of cooperation. And I would like to cite that the lessons from the Gulf countries are very instructive in this regard. You look at Qatar, you look at the United Arab Emirates, not large by territory or population, but they've used diplomatic agility, strategic investment, and a willingness to talk to all sides, and thus become essential diplomatic actors. And such influence does not arrive overnight. It comes through active and international diplomacy, grounded in the belief that engagement with difficult interlocutors is often more productive than isolation. Our own choices in India are shaped by our history and security concerns, but there is something to learn from these examples I've cited, engaging in dialogue and offering platforms for regional conversation. So, India, like every country represented here, seeks greater agency, and it will continue to adapt. Now, I think Joanne mentioned the question of whether India is a middle power. And I'd like to just touch on that before I conclude. Now, India is not the classic quintessential middle power in your definition of the word. It's more, I think, a rising major power, a leading power, as some like to call it, with, I would say, middle power instincts. And it is very secure on middle ground. It's a country of continental scale. It has nuclear capability. It has a global diplomatic footprint, and it has the weight to shape outcomes. You look at the G20, you look at BRICS, you look at the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. So I think India is a threshold nation on the cusp of a major power role. And it also has a unique bridging capacity. It can convene, as I mentioned earlier, it can interpret. And ultimately, it really is a bridging power, and we have the ability to do all these. Now, the challenge for India is to be the stabilizing, integrating, bridge building force that the world needs. So, once again, let me return to where I began, to this island at the heart of Southeast Asia, Singapore, and which teaches us that size is not destiny and geography is not constraint. And I think there's a lesson in it for many middle powers. And also, I think what you represent, and to a large extent, what we represent in India, is that multipolarity does not mean rival camps, and it can mean many voices, and where influence is earned through fairness, through wisdom, and collaboration. So, what we need is for a role by middle powers not to compete with great powers, not to choose sides, but to widen the space for cooperation and to remove mistrust. And that's the belief that we need to carry with us, to be patient, to be resolute, and to be possessing of the imagination that we should have if we have to use our positioning system as middle powers to make the future a better place. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador Rao, for your wisdom. I would really have loved to listen to your full speech, but because, in the interest of time, we have to move on. But of course, you made very, very important points, starting with India being an omnidirectional country right at the beginning. And we always look at it as a country that has strategic autonomy. But of course, these days, we see it as a multi-alignment. Instead. And in fact, I had an article called India Can Have Its Cake and eat it too, because it's almost in every single platform, and being friends with almost everyone and enemy to none. I mean, there's a lot that we can learn from it. But yes, indeed, if India was a major power, then it wouldn't be unipolar, bipolar, it might be tripolar, and giving it a lot more a space, on how you want to interact on this range of multipolar polarity world. So, okay, now we don't have much time. So now I am going on to Prof. Thitinan, because we have already heard perspectives on the major powers. So now I think Prof. Thitinan's topic is extremely relevant, and we need to talk about this, which is ASEAN's place in a multipolar world and the rising global south. So really, we would like to hear your perspective on how ASEAN can assert itself, really amidst the global fragmentation that we have been talking about all morning, and position itself as a bridge between the traditional and emerging powers. So similarly, if you can keep to 15 minutes, that would be great, so that we have sufficient time for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Good morning, everyone, and I want to thank first Director Choi for inviting me here, and to your team. I want to perhaps contextualize my contribution in with what has been said by both Deputy Minister Liu Jintong and also Ambassador Kritenbrink. This is a very timely roundtable. I mean, the past week is supposed to be an ASEAN-related summit kind of week, but it turned out to be a Trump tour of Asia. And I think next week I think by Monday, a lot of people will wake up and maybe have a buyer's remorse about what has been agreed. I look at the agreements in detail last night. I'm thinking, what did we get out of this for Thailand and Malaysia and Cambodia and Vietnam, and the others might bear this in mind. So the dust was settled after the Trump trip. I don't know if he'll come again. I think he learned from 2017. He made that trip, and then he kind of came up with this FOIP, and he didn't find his footing, and then he didn't come again. But this time, he really made a tour of it. So the first stop in KL, I think, Ambassador Kritenbrink has given us a kind of an overview of the dense and deep engagement and ties between US and ASEAN, Southeast Asia. But in fact, it came across to me a little bit like, maybe President Obama was still the president, Barack Obama, and maybe the Biden administration was still running the White House. In fact, Trump is very different, and Trump too is profoundly different. He has been weaponizing U.S. prosperity against the international system. I think this is, and for us in ASEAN, we are really shocked, and I think he's gone around. If you think about it, ASEAN has convening authority, but Trump almost did not come. He conditioned his attendance at the ASEAN, related summit on the Thai-Cambodian truce, peace agreement. He called it peace treaty. It was really kind of a declaration, an intention to have peace. I think the situation between Thailand and Cambodia is still very, very raw, very, very delicate along the border. The dispute, I think, will be long-lasting. And I think Cambodia now has really no friends in Thailand. Cambodian people dislike the Thai military and Thai government, and vice versa. The Thai people, despise the Hun family. So it's a long-running kind of conflict now, I think. Before coming here, I thought before this past week, I've been a bit down on ASEAN. Since over the years, I pick up to the watershed years. To me, it was 2025, definitely, because the country that constructed the international system is turning against it and weaponizing its own market, first resort, last resort consumer market against the world. But the other year that I think would be kind of an inflection year would be 2012. 2001 is very important. China entered the WTO, but 2012, ASEAN did not have a joint statement on the South China Sea, and we know all about that under the Cambodian chairmanship. And since then, the Scarborough Show and the rise of Xi Jinping coincided with the rise of Xi Jinping. And then in 2013, the Belt and Road announcement, geostrategy. And you come down the time frame. The takeover of South China Sea, building artificial islands of out of rocks and reefs and weaponizing them. And then the Permanent Court of Arbitration in July 2016 decided comprehensively against China, and that was ignored by China. And then you come down the line to the Myanmar coup in 2021, the Russian invasion of Ukraine the following year, and then the Palestine, Israel-Hamas war, and then finally lots of conflicts and frictions culminating with this border war between Thailand and Cambodia. This is a serious, deadly, unprecedented intra-ASEAN military clash for 5 days. Heavy weaponry, fighter jets, artillery, BM-21 rockets. 43 people died. Trump said he saved millions of lives. 43 is back, but it's not millions. This is an existential crisis for ASEAN. There's an internal conflict in Myanmar. There's an intra-ASEAN military conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. So I've been kind of down on ASEAN, and this old cliche about ASEAN being glass half empty, glass half full, and is together and apart at the same time. I felt like it's been like half empty and leaking until this past week. I thought I'm a little bit more energized about ASEAN. There's some, I think, because the U.S. has been so belligerent, and I think Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said about, he said something about the U.S. Forcing us to look at the world as kind of a world -1. So in the short term, in the medium term, we have no choice but to appease and accommodate the Trump demands, these tariff threats and trade demands and this kind of make America great again, all of that. But in the medium term, the rest of the Trump years, I don't know if he'll come again next year or year after, there will be more movements, maneuvers to circumvent and bypass the US. So I think that the Global South, the BRICS Plus, the GCC, China, ASEAN still has a convening power, despite Trump coming on the condition of some kind of a signing so that he can be, the global peacemaker. And he said it's number 8, and he wants to be the Nobel Prize winner for peace. Despite all of that, the other countries still came. Brazil, Latin America, I think that's a region of the Global South. You'll see, Canada wants to have a trade agreement with ASEAN, EU, of course. So you'll see, I think, in the rest of the Trump term, second term, more movements, maneuvers that will bypass, circumvent, and certainly minimize the risks that are coming from the Trump tariff threats and these trade demands and unilateral protectionist measures. I also am heartened by the Timor-Leste membership. This completes, as Minister Liu said, the One Southeast Asia project from the 1990s. It was 30 years ago, in the 1990s, Anwar Ibrahim, Surin Piswan, and the cohort of these think tankers at that time, really, and also politicians. They envisioned after the Cold War that Southeast Asia would come together as one, and this would be the basis, the core, the cradle of ASEAN. So I think the completion with Timor-Leste membership has made that happen. A lot of people worry about the further dilution of ASEAN, because now with 11 member states, and Timor-Leste is small, has less capacity, but I think overall it was already diluted. With Timor-Leste as a kind of a democratic country, that will also tip the balance among the ASEAN member states between this, kind of autocratic regimes roughly and democratic regimes, systems roughly. And this will be consequential for issues like Myanmar, civil war and the sham election that they're having in December and January. What would ASEAN say to that? How can ASEAN still utilize a 5-point consensus? So I think this is really something to really cheer and raise a glass to the completion of the One Southeast Asia. And now I think it's not half full, half empty, and not half empty leaking, but more half full again. And I think that looking forward, we need to reimagine the kind of reimagination that Mr. Liu talked about. It requires reforms, some very serious reforms that ASEAN has to be thinking about. And we cannot just have meetings and have these declarations, statements, but actually really looking how ASEAN can work more effectively. So I have some suggestions. The ASEAN Secretary General should not have a 5-year term. It is too long. We all know it's too long. Right? It should be a 2-year term, even a 1-year term. And the chair country is rotational, it's alphabetical. But before you chair again, it takes 11 years now. So it could be a 6-month term. The ASEAN section should be the best candidate, like a CEO, like a central bank governor. It should be paid well. It should not have to be alphabetical and last 5 years. There should not be twice a year summits. I mean, not enough to talk about for twice a year. So maybe once a year. And the leadership, the leaders, very important. In the 1990s, the leadership had a camaraderie, a certain spirit to them. So I think that the leaders also changed a lot. Like in Thailand, we changed a lot of leaders, one a year recently. That's not good. Singapore, they have a long-lasting leaders. But the unilateral leaders meetings or camaraderie can be promoted and then brought into the wider group. I think the leaders are very important. And then all the bureaucracy, and we can talk about how to reform the bureaucracy. Joanne will know. But I think that ASEAN, I like the customs union idea because that will force ASEAN to tighten economic cooperation. And Director Choi mentioned about the supranationality. That won't happen in the way that it happened in the EU, in the evolution of the EU. But I think that we can look at another way, that sovereignty in a limited way can be pooled in a variable geometry. So it doesn't have to always be the ASEAN consensus, the ASEAN way of deciding to do things, but it can also be different modalities. So I would say maybe ASEAN original 5 plus X. We used to say ASEAN 10 minus X, but I think the original 5 are really still aligned on the key issues. If you look at the divisions on Russia, Ukraine, on Israel wars in the Middle East and so on, the ASEAN 5 are really kind of aligned on Myanmar, on US, China, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, on the Russia, Vietnam and Laos have consistently abstained from the UN resolutions against Russian aggression. So this is kind of a different way of thinking about ASEAN that requires some reforms in order to reimagine what it can do. And I think now, Southeast Asia has found this past week that ASEAN is the one and only agency that this region has. There can never be an occasion where Laos or Brunei or Cambodia leaders can sit in the same room with Trump, or other world leaders, major powers. So it's still, I think the realization, it's nice to be reassured the U.S. wants to engage and kind of reaffirmation that you talked about, Ambassador Kritenbrink, but we don't see it that way. The U.S. is unreliable. The U.S. is belligerent. What the U.S. is doing is going to drive us. It's going to alienate itself from the international system that it constructed. And what we do about that is the middle powers, the middle ways. And this is it requires some thinking on our part. And I think that what Deputy Minister Liu talked about is a kind of a new frontiers of decision-making, of ways and means in ASEAN. And I think very much welcome Timor-Leste in it. The contributions to the ASEAN Secretariat, I think is a good point that it doesn't have to be on equal basis. The wealthier countries can pay more. Interesting that you didn't mention Thailand as one of the 4 countries you mentioned. It really saddened me. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to take too much time within 15 minutes coming up. The US is alienating itself from the system that it constructed. And World Minus One, I think, is not a bad, it's an apt description of what we will be seeing. And there'll be a blowback against the Trump tariffs and trade agreements. People realize that this is a raw deal, and we're forced into it because we have no choice. In the meantime, we have no choice. But when we have a choice, when we can cultivate other modalities, we will go that way. So the title, I think, is very apt, Director Choi. Surviving or thriving, I think that ASEAN will survive. If it survives well enough, if the grouping survives well enough, then I think it can thrive in its own ASEAN kind of way. Not ASEAN way, but ASEAN kind of way. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Prof. Thitinan. And yes, I do believe that ASEAN will survive. And I actually also agree with you that ASEAN definitely does have convening power, as we just saw in the summit that took place this week. And totally agree with you on the Timor-Leste that we have finally completed a project that is 14 years in the making. And later in the last session, we are going to have a Timor-Leste ambassador to China that's going to talk about this topic. And I'm sure that would be very, very exciting. And I like the point about ASEAN being half full and sometimes became half empty and then half full again. And then now I'm thinking, why don't we try to get it 3/4 full? And then before long, we can have it 100% full, yeah? I think that's what we can. And I'm so glad the ASEAN SecGen is not here. But yes, maybe we should consider, his term, as well. Since that the chairmanship is only 1 year, yes. And let's continue to think about new modalities for ASEAN and innovative ways that, we can help to make ASEAN survive even more. Thank you. So now we have about 15 minutes, or we can drag it on slightly more for Q&As. But, since we don't have much time, I'm just going to open up the floor immediately to audiences. Yes, I already saw hands. Is that Ha? Okay, yes, my colleague Ha. Well, she used to also be another ASEAN expert. We were both in the ASEAN Secretariat together. Let's not tell Dr. Kao this, okay? Anyways, if you have other questions, please queue up. Okay, anyways, we will see your hand and we'll pass you the mic. But over to you first, Ha. Please go ahead. Is your mic working?
Working.
Okay, now
okay,
it is.
now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for your presentations. I have two questions for Ambassador Dan Kritenbrink, if I may. The first one is about a recent report by Nikkei Asia, actually yesterday, about a few geopolitically charged provisions embedded in the trade deals between the US and Malaysia and Cambodia, which implicitly target China. For example, about the need to mirror the US regulations or export controls, or about the need to provide information on investment by a third country to the US upon request. What are your thoughts about the prospect of the implementation of these provisions? And how do you think that they may impact the positioning of Southeast Asian economies in the global supply chains that are still trying to straddle between the US and China? And the second question, since you are now with the Asia Group that advises corporate America on the nexus between the business and geopolitics, can you please share with us some insights about how American corporations with heavy investments in Asia managed or navigated the tariffs under the second Trump administration so far? And how have they prepared themselves for the potentiality of the 40% tariffs slapped on transshipment goods? Basically, to be in line with the theme of this session, how have they tried to survive and thrive in this era? Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic question. Do you want me to dive in, or did you want to take multiple questions first?
Do we have another question on this related topic? If not, then yes, please, Ambassador, please address this, and then we take the rest later.
I think it's a really timely question. You may have noted I was quoted in Ken Moriyasu's comment in the Nikkei on this. And I alluded to it in my remarks when I somewhat obliquely said, one of the challenges going forward is that these issues related to, at least as the US describes it, economic security, so-called transshipment issues, Chinese content issues, I think will remain very sensitive and difficult for Southeast Asian friends going forward. I don't have the agreement in front of me, but there is agreement in the language that does talk about how this has to be done in a bilateral way, right? So Malaysia has made these commitments, but then it says that it will be done through consultation. But this will be very difficult. This is in some ways the nightmare scenario for friends in ASEAN, right? Who have historically said we don't want to choose. We want to preserve our ability to make choices, but don't want to be squeezed and put in that uncomfortable position. And there is at least the risk, that this pressure could put Southeast Asian friends in that situation. And of course, in the context of President Xi Jinping's visit to the region earlier, my summary of his message to friends in the region was, you do whatever you want in terms of cooperating with the United States, just don't do it at our expense, otherwise there'll be consequences. So this will be challenging going forward. I think Minister Liu probably has views on this subject. But I think what's motivating the Trump administration from doing this, of course, is the concern that historically, and certainly over the last decade plus, I think friends in China have used transshipment and other means to facilitate their exports to the United States. And so this is an attempt by the Trump administration to try to close loopholes so that deals concluded with friends in Southeast Asia, the benefits accrue to those countries in the United States and not China. But I'll be very blunt. I don't know exactly how this is going to be implemented. I don't know how you measure and track these issues. This will be a very difficult piece of diplomacy, I think, for both the United States and the entire region going forward. And then on your question about, my new job as a partner at the Asia Group, look, these issues are existential, not just for friends in the region, but for major corporations, and not just the United States as well. We work with many Asian partners and multinationals as well. I would say to date, it's been quite interesting to me. We've not seen major shifts in supply chains or FDI yet. I think just as many negotiators have stated, I think many of our clients have also noted that the fact that tariff levels have remained relatively uniform across the region has had some probably positive impact in most investors and supply chains sort of staying put. The fact that those tariff levels have come down to a more manageable level, I think they've been reassuring as well. But I know I'm talking to economists in the United States and across the region, I don't think we've seen the full effect of these tariffs as well. I think there's been a bit of a lag. So we have to watch this very closely. But thus far, for the reasons that I've mentioned, I've not seen fundamental shifts. But this is hugely important. Supply chains have been globalized. Profit margins are razor thin from many corporations who have invested in this region primarily for export. Again, existential crisis, but haven't seen a huge shift in those behaviors yet.
William, could you please introduce yourself, sir?
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. Augustine Aswan, journalist. So thanks, Dr. Thitinan, for your frank assessment. You said what had to be said on the ASEAN Secretariat and the role of the Secretary General. But my question is really about what's happening with US-Philippine exercises. So my question is for Ambassador Daniel and Dr. Ma. I just came back from Manila. And the very hotel that I stayed in is the default hotel for the advanced force for the US Marines. And the rest of the force will come in and the exercises will be ongoing. So what's your reaction to the US and the Philippines with their joint exercises, which has continued regardless of who is in the White House? It's been going on for a long time. And how does China view these exercises between the US and the Philippines, which is growing in strength? And it's interesting to note it's posted on the website. Other ships have joined in the US-Philippine exercise as well. So I want to add a third alphabet to the title. This session is called Fractured Fluid, and I would add a third word, faulted. Building on the tectonic plates, it's not just the geological tectonic plates. These developments of joint exercises are not exactly by coincidence that they take place where the issues are being discussed. So would love to hear your frank assessment going into 2026. How do you view US, Philippines, and China just observing across? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, regarding U.S. Philippines military access, actually, I want to use a metaphor to describe the current situation in the South China Sea. I know many countries and many people don't agree with China's position. I think that's perfectly normal. I think China has no aspiration to solve the territorial dispute in the South China Sea in the foreseeable future. But I think China's intention is to manage the crisis, not to be leading to a direct confrontation, conflicts, or even war, as other part of the region has witnessed. So if you think about South China Sea as a movie theater, I think there's love stories. That means China's relation with Malaysia, with Indonesia, even with Vietnam, that can be considered as a love story, right? It's a lovers fight and they argue, but they can manage. And then you have a thrill. Thrill is what China and the Philippines are actually doing, right? But we have a no actions movie at this moment, right? But if there will be loss of life and large scale of conflicts, then people will probably really witness action movies. So what China and the urged ASEAN country trying to do is to prevent this disagreement or crisis erupt into actions. Right. As for the U.S. China Philippine military access, the Chinese perfectly understand Manila is a long-term trading island of the U.S. And it has its own security concern. Many regional countries join access with Manila and Australia, Japan. They all come. But I think, as Ambassador just mentioned, that he's perfectly okay to feel that the regional country collaborate with each other or even with China, but not at the expense of the U.S. I think that principle also apply to the Chinese government.
The only point I would make, Dr. Mabo, is I was actually trying to describe Chinese policy along those lines. But I guess to the question, I would start by saying, Dr. Thitinan, for whom I have the utmost respect, I hear your message. I think the point that I'm trying to make, even though the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration are different in so many ways, I reflect when I was ambassador to Vietnam in the first Trump administration, I used to tell Vietnamese friends that whether you like U.S. trade policy or not, the United States is still going to remain central, I think, to many of these issues and questions. There will still be continuity even amidst change. And if you take the long-term perspective, I do think that our national interests are clear. I hope that the outcome is not as Dr. Thitinan described, but we also have to recognize we can't tell yet, and we have to be, I think, mindful of what the risks are. And I mention that because when I see the situation in the South China Sea, I still see tremendous continuity, right? We all know what the stakes are, not just for ASEAN member states and claimant states, but really I think for the entire world and for a world that cares about the free and unfettered commerce flowing through that vitally important body and principles of resolving disputes peacefully in accordance with international law. And so it was really that theme of consistency, even amidst change, that I was trying to advance today. And that's why I think you see actually tremendous continuity in the U.S. approach to the South China Sea, to our allies, and why you see those joint exercises going on. Again, I find it quite striking. In a year defined primarily by disruption and concern, particularly regarding the Trump administration's trade policies, when I reflect on his most recent visit here, I thought it was quite successful. I thought it surprised on the upside. And I thought the main theme that came through all of those, at least to me, was stability. After this period of disruption, things seem to have settled into more of a pattern. I think you could make the same argument on the engagement between President Trump and President Xi, but of course we should state the obvious. I think at best that is a short-term tactical stabilization. I think the fundamentals of the US-China relationship remain unchanged, and there will certainly be turbulence and choppiness going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I saw two more hands. One is from my colleague, Dr. William Chung. You still? And then later on, also another colleague from ISEAS, Dr. Sak. So if it's possible, let's extend this session by 5 minutes. We will quickly take the two questions and quickly get responses from the panel. Thank you. Mic not working, William?
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Joe. Just making sure that nobody else is in front of me. Thanks again for your insights. I have two comments, one to Dr. Ma and one to Ambassador Dan Kritenbrink. Dr. Ma, I think you said something akin to the fact China has not used force or invaded any country in recent history. I'm sorry, I beg to differ. 1962, Sino-India War, Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. 1979, Sino-Vietnam border war, and again skirmishes in the South China Sea vis-a-vis South Vietnam and Vietnam, 1974, 1988. To Ambassador Dan, I'm sure if we are of the certain vintage to remember A Few Good Men, Colonel Jessup played by Jack Nicholson, saying that we need US Marines on that wall on Guantanamo Bay. And I think many of the Southeast Asians will agree with me that we want the US to stay engaged in the region. Unfortunately, I share Professor Thitinan's kind of pessimistic outlook on the US approach to Southeast Asia. I give you 3 data points. Number one, as Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong has indicated, the reciprocal tariffs are an existential threat to Southeast Asia's economic development. I don't want to, gloss over it. And Southeast Asians are looking elsewhere. If you look at the fact that there's now talk of an RCEP, CPTPP joining up with the European Union, forming a mega trade bloc that comprises 2/3 of global GDP, the US is a very obvious absentee for such a mega trade bloc. And I think if the US doesn't want to play ball, I guess Southeast Asians will have to look elsewhere. Third data point, Lee Kuan Yew School has just come out with an anatomy of choices made by Southeast Asia, and it's very clear that if you look at common memberships in multilateral organizations, their interactions with the Chinese, Southeast Asians are increasingly choosing China at the expense of the United States. So I beg to differ on your rather sanguine kind of comments on US engagement, which I appreciate. Thanks.
Well, thanks, William, for your extensive research and all that historical facts. But okay, now, Sak, can you keep your question very short?
Actually, I want to talk
no,
about
I think,
ASEAN Secretariat contribution. But anyway,
Yes.
I have a question for Ajahn Thitinan. Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam invited only President Trump to the signing ceremony. Did they already choose USA over China in that event? Is that the implication that they make a choice?
Thanks, Sak, for your shortest question I've ever heard. Thanks. Okay, so can I give a 1-minute answer can come from Prof. Thitinan on that 1-minute question, but later on the tough ones will be for Prof. Daniel and Dr. Mapo. Wrap up the session. Thanks.
Dr. Sak, you meant Thailand, Cambodia, and Malaysia. Malaysia, okay. Yeah, I think it's, Malaysia needed the US to be there as a chair, to have the convening authority. But if you look at it, Trump made a whole trip beyond ASEAN. Normally you have an ASEAN-related summits, they come to ASEAN-related summits, they go home. He came to the ASEAN-related summits, and then he went on to Japan and Korea. And the culmination really capped off at the end by the meeting with President Xi Jinping. That was a main draw for him. And And along the way, he collects all these, self-declared achievements. For him, so for Malaysia, very, very clear, as chair, you need to convene. And the US, with what it's doing, you cannot really do without the US being there, and ideally the president, because it's swinging its weight all over the world in the international system and the trade threats and the tariffs and so on. For Thailand and Cambodia, so for Trump, it was trade for peace, right? You want to trade, you want to have trade deals, you have peace, and you have photo with me as the presiding sponsor, peacemaker. So for him, it's that. For Malaysia, it's the US president. For Thailand and Cambodia, interesting. I mean, the situation is still very tense, and I know that even to the last minute, they had a lot of deliberations, a lot of, consultation discussions about the terms, and Thailand has some conditions, Cambodia has some conditions, very contentious. But at the end of it, they both needed Trump to come because they wanted to do trade deals. Because what was announced on the Liberation Day, so-called, was a kind of a draft, parameters. But the final deals still have to be signed. So for both Thailand and Cambodia, that was the deal. So for Trump, you want to trade, you need to have peace and my sponsorship. For Cambodia and Thailand, they have peace for Trump so that they can have trade deals with the US. And now I'm wondering what kind of trade deals they got from the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Now over to you, Ambassador, if you can, maybe 2 minutes on a difficult one.
Sure, no, thank you. And look, I think that if in fact the result of Trump administration trade policy is the complete isolation of the United States, as I think Dr. Thitinan has said is a real possibility, or is happening, and as the questioner has mentioned, then I think obviously that will be incredibly disadvantageous to the United States. I certainly hope that doesn't happen. Hope is not a policy, obviously. But I don't know if I could be convinced right here at this moment that is a preordained outcome, especially just thinking about the long arc of our history together in this region and the fundamental, I think, American national interest for remaining engaged in this region that we've talked about. But certainly the message that you've conveyed and that Dr. Thitinan has conveyed is quite striking to me, and something I will take back to Washington to share with friends across the political spectrum in Washington, D.C. Again, I fundamentally believe, and I think our history indicates that the more we stay engaged, the more we work together, the more we all benefit. But I've certainly heard your warning. I guess maybe the final comment I would make on the survey you mentioned from the Lee Kuan Yew School, and countries are increasingly choosing China. I assume this is some sort of a poll you're referring to. I guess after having spent at least my lifetime to date engaged with friends in the region, I don't know that I've ever met anyone here who wants to choose or that thinks about the world in increasingly binary terms. I'm somewhat skeptical that even in the worst case that we're talking about here is the theoretical worst case, that it somehow automatically means that the region runs into Beijing's arms. I do think the more likely outcome is what has been described here, is that countries will pursue their own interests, including maintaining a balance with China by seeking options other than the United States. At least that's been my conclusion after a few decades of working with friends here. And for Dr. Thitinan, I would just say, again, the points that I'm trying to make here today are reflecting the world as it is in this current moment, and then thinking about, I think, some of the areas where there are still opportunities to work together and to maintain the interests that we do share. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now, finally, for us to close the session, I will get Dr. Mapo to defend China's policy.
Thank you, Vivian. I didn't dispute the fact because you correctly point that, except you didn't really pay much attention to my speech. But having said that, I think it actually in the 1962 China-Indian border war and the 70s, the partial islands Navy fight actually bring scars until now for both China's relation with Vietnam and with India. So that further demonstrates that if you resolve disputes by force, actually it probably needs decades, if not centuries, to amend that. So I think China actually learning these lessons to claim that it prefer to use the peaceful way to solve the dispute. And so far, I think it hasn't changed. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Mapo. I'm supposed to wrap up this session, but I know that my colleague, Miss Sharon Xia, is she still in the room? Yes, Sharon. She said that Ambassador Rao didn't get to answer any question. So, I mean, can you give a 1 minute question, and then maybe I'll get Ambassador Rao to also very quickly. I'm sorry
Yeah.
that I'm not managing the time
Thanks,
well,
thanks,
but let's
Joanne.
be fair.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you so much. Actually, I would love to listen to Ambassador Rao even more. But very, very quick question, which is you talked about, the convening powers, and so if collectively ASEAN could be a middle power, and I'm just wondering, looking forward, do you think there's a chance, given that also Malaysia has experimented with doing an ASEAN GCC China summit, that there is a chance we can have an ASEAN BRICS summit followed by an ASEAN BRICS EU summit, because these are the countries that are not talking together?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that, and I'd like to just briefly allude to what Mapo said about the India-China conflict of 1962, and the fact that China and India have tried for decades to resolve this problem peacefully and continue to do so. And I think we need intensified efforts to make sure that we build more common ground on that issue. To answer your question on the different permutations and combinations for middle powers to convene and to discuss issues that I mentioned are of common concern to everybody in the region, I think there's definitely a case, an opening, an option for that, which we must pursue. And as far as India is concerned, as I said, our orientation towards Southeast Asia is not just historical or geographical, it is very much dictated by the compulsions of modern statecraft and mutual benefit and mutual interest. So I think we should sit down together and explore the possibilities. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rao. We did this in a very short time. Okay, so I think I have to bring this to an absolute close due to the interest of time. I think we had a very exceptionally rich discussion this morning, and one that captures the complexities of ASEAN's strategic environment and its evolving role in the world. So on that note, please let me thank Ambassador Kritenbrink, Dr. Mapo, Ambassador Rao, and Professor Thitinan for sharing their insights. And I do hope that this discussion will set the stage for the rest of today's conversation on how ASEAN can not only survive but thrive in an age of tariffs, tensions, and transitions. And I hope that, and I would like to encourage you to stay on as well for the afternoon session, because we have a lot of great speakers that are being lined up to talk about emerging economic topics, and also later on to look at some of the ASEAN institutional matters. I'm going to pass the time over to the MC, and don't worry, I'm sure you'll have sufficient time for lunch.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lin, Ambassador Kritenbrink, Dr. Ma, Ambassador Rao, and Professor Pongsudhirak for a very engaging discussion. It is now my pleasure to invite you to lunch in the foyer outside.